It was time, really. The reason all of us in the Beatles shied away from Beatles material directly after the breakup.
When most people think about Paul McCartney, they picture the charming Beatle with his melodic bass lines and boyish smile. They remember him as the songwriter who created Yesterday and as a cultural icon who helped change popular music forever. But behind his knighthood and cheerful public image is a man who had very strong opinions about other musicians. While Sir Paul has always kept a diplomatic face in public throughout his career, people close to him have seen moments when his polite mask slipped, showing sharp criticism of bands that didn't meet his high standards. According to former Wings guitarist Denny Laine, in a rare 2018 interview, Paul could be brutally honest when it came to music. There was always a kind of competition between them, Laine revealed, a friendly competition where they would challenge each other to come up with something better. Paul knew exactly what he liked and what he didn't like, and he wasn't afraid to say it when they were alone together, away from the public eye. From heated arguments during the British invasion to dismissive comments about punk rockers who challenged his musical legacy, McCartney's private opinions about certain artists showed a competitive side that casual fans rarely got to see. His musical feuds weren't just about personal differences between people. They reflected deeper disagreements about artistic direction, songwriting philosophy, and what rock music should ultimately represent and achieve. The Rolling Stones. More than just friendly competition. The Beatles versus Rolling Stones rivalry defined an entire generation of music fans. But what people didn't see was how personal it became behind the scenes. While publicly maintaining what looked like friendly competition, McCartney repeatedly took subtle jabs at the Stones throughout his career. According to reports, McCartney once told producer George Martin Duro, in a late-night recording session at Abbey Road in 1968, that he had always thought the Rolling Stones were just a blues cover band that got lucky. While that particular comment never made headlines at the time, Paul's feelings about the Stones have leaked out in more measured ways over the decades. In a 2021 New Yorker interview, McCartney couldn't help himself when discussing the rivalry. He admitted he wasn't sure he should say it, but he described them as, basically, a blues cover band, adding that he thought the Beatles' musical net was cast much wider than the Stones' approach to music. Mick Jagger quickly responded to these comments, calling the Beatles a four-piece band with one drummer while joking about how the Stones were still filling stadiums around the world. The root of Paul's dislike seems to stem from what he saw as the Stones' derivative nature. Former Apple Records executive Peter Brown revealed that Paul always felt the Stones were following in the Beatles' footsteps, releasing similar album concepts months after the Beatles had already broken that same ground and moved on to new territory. Even more telling was McCartney's reaction when John Lennon briefly considered producing a Rolling Stones album in 1969. According to studio engineer Jeff Emmerich, Paul was visibly irritated by this news, questioning why John would waste his talents working with them when the Beatles had their own projects that needed attention and development. While McCartney has occasionally praised specific Rolling Stones songs over the years, the underlying competitive tension between him and the band has never fully disappeared. When Rolling Stone magazine asked about the rivalry in 2016, Paul's diplomatic answer still carried a noticeable edge, as he said they were a great band. But they just weren't the Beatles, were they? The Sex Pistols, punk rock rebellion. If there was one musical movement that really got under Paul McCartney's skin, it was punk rock. And no band represented that rebellion more completely than the Sex Pistols. When the anarchic foursome emerged in 1976 with their raw, aggressive sound and anti-establishment message, McCartney was reportedly deeply upset by their deliberate rejection of everything he had helped build in popular music. According to Linda McCartney's brother John Eastman in a rare 2003 interview, Paul considered their music to be an assault on his ears. He couldn't understand why anyone would celebrate musicians who couldn't play their instruments properly, which was part of the punk aesthetic and philosophy. The feeling was completely mutual between the two camps. When the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen climbed the charts during the same week that McCartney's Mull of Kintyre was riding high, Johnny Rotten publicly dismissed Paul as a dinosaur, representing everything that punk music stood against and wanted to destroy. What truly made McCartney angry wasn't just their musical approach, but their direct attacks on his legacy and everything he had worked to achieve. According to Wings drummer Denny Seiwell, Paul was particularly hurt when he heard that the Sex Pistols were using Beatles posters for target practice during their rehearsals. Seiwell recalled that Paul tried to laugh it off when he heard about it, but you could tell it bothered him very deeply. The tension reached its peak when both acts found themselves recording in neighboring studios at London's AIR facility in early 1977. Studio manager Dave Harris remembered that Paul made a friendly gesture to introduce himself to the punk band, and apparently Sid Vicious muttered something about establishment sellouts in response. McCartney turned on his heel and never acknowledged them again for the rest of their time at the studio. For years later, McCartney would grudgingly admit that the punk movement had cleared the air in music and brought some energy back to rock, but he never warmed to the Sex Pistols specifically. During a 2016 BBC interview, when asked about the band, Paul simply replied that they weren't really his cup of tea, with a tightness in his voice that revealed his true feelings about them even decades later. Oasis, Beatles, worship gone wrong. The Britpop phenomenon of the 1990s saw Oasis emerge as self-proclaimed Beatles disciples, with Noel Gallagher openly worshipping McCartney's songwriting abilities and citing him as a major influence. You might think this kind of admiration would flatter Paul, but behind closed doors it apparently had exactly the opposite effect on him. According to McCartney's longtime publicist, Jeff Baker, Paul found their Beatles obsession tiresome and borderline insulting to his work. He felt they were reducing his life's work to a handful of copied chords and recycled melodies without understanding the deeper creativity and innovation that went into the original songs. What particularly irritated McCartney was Oasis's brash attitude combined with what he perceived as derivative, unoriginal music. During a private dinner in 1997, Paul reportedly told George Martin that while Oasis had gotten the swagger right, where was the innovation? He pointed out that the Beatles never just copied their musical heroes, they transformed them into something completely new and original. The tension wasn't helped by the Gallagher brothers' notorious outspokenness and tendency to make bold claims in interviews. When Noel claimed in a 1996 interview that Oasis was bigger than the Beatles, McCartney was reportedly furious about the comparison. According to Beatles biographer Philip Norman, Paul called such comparisons ridiculous and privately dismissed the band as arrogant upstarts, parts with half the talent and twice the ego of successful musicians. A particularly awkward encounter occurred at the 2000 Q Awards, when both McCartney and Oasis were receiving honors at the same ceremony. Backstage, Liam Gallagher apparently approached Paul for an autograph, only to be met with a surprisingly cool reception. One witness described McCartney as cordial but clearly uncomfortable throughout the entire exchange. Over the years, Paul has softened his stance somewhat, occasionally acknowledging Oasis's impact on keeping guitar music relevant during the 1990s. However, those in his inner circle maintain that he never quite got over what he saw as their shameless plundering of the Beatles' sound without adding anything genuinely new. When asked directly about Oasis in a 2018 GQ interview, McCartney offered a tellingly brief response, saying they had good songs but wishing they had found their own voice. The Monkees. Manufactured music. Few bands drew McCartney's quiet scorn quite like the Monkees. While the world saw them as harmless entertainment for television and young fans, Paul allegedly viewed them as a cynical corporate exploitation of everything the Beatles had pioneered and worked hard to achieve. According to Beatles assistant Alistair Taylor in his memoir, Paul considered them a plastic imitation of real musicians. Taylor recalled that Paul would change radio stations whenever Monkees songs came on during car rides to the recording studio, showing his obvious distaste for their music. The Monkees' manufactured origins particularly bothered McCartney, who had spent years developing his musical skills in Hamburg's clubs before achieving fame with the Beatles. During a heated discussion with manager Brian Epstein in 1967, Paul reportedly said that the Monkees were making a mockery of what the Beatles had built through years of hard work. He saw them as four actors pretending to be a band, which he found insulting to real musicians. The tension escalated when the Monkees' television show began incorporating psychedelic elements after the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's release. According to George Harrison, McCartney viewed this as blatant theft of their ideas. Paul would get properly wound up about it, Harrison recalled, saying that the Monkees were following the Beatles' blueprint without doing any of the actual creative work themselves. A particularly awkward moment came at a Los Angeles party in 1968, when McCartney reportedly snubbed Mickey Dolenz by walking away mid-conversation. Dolenz later recalled that he didn't think Paul ever accepted the Monkees as legitimate musicians, despite their later efforts to gain creative control and become a real band. Even though the Monkees eventually fought for creative control and became genuine musicians who wrote and played their own material, McCartney's opinion never fully changed. When asked about them in a 2011 interview, his diplomatic response still carried an unmistakable edge, as he said they had some catchy tunes, but they certainly weren't the Beatles, were they? The Bee Gees' disco dominance. The disco explosion of the late 1970s saw the Bee Gees achieve unprecedented commercial success just as McCartney's post-Wings career hit a difficult period. This timing created what insiders describe as a simmering resentment from Paul toward the Gibb brothers and their massive success. According to producer Chris Thomas, Paul felt blindsided by the disco movement. Here were these three brothers suddenly selling more records than the Beatles ever did with the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and Paul took it personally as a challenge to his legacy and relevance in popular music. McCartney's frustration allegedly stemmed from what he saw as the Bee Gees' transformation from Beatles sound-alikes in their early career to disco superstars. According to Wings guitarist Laurence Joubert, Paul would listen to their falsetto harmonies and mutter about how they had abandoned their original sound purely for commercial gain, sacrificing artistic integrity for sales. The rivalry intensified when both acts were recording at the same Miami studio in 1979. Studio manager Tony Bongiovi remembered that Paul would deliberately schedule his recording sessions to avoid running into the Bee Gees. When someone mentioned that the Bee Gees had broken another chart record, witnesses said Paul would visibly tense up at the news. What particularly irritated McCartney was the critical acclaim the Bee Gees received during their disco period. When they were hailed as songwriting geniuses following their disco reinvention, Paul reportedly told his band members that they were using the same three chords as everyone else in pop music. They had just sped them up and added a drum machine to make them sound modern. While Paul has never publicly attacked the Bee Gees, his conspicuous omission of them when discussing influential artists speaks volumes about his true feelings. Even during a 2001 tribute following Maurice Gibb's death, McCartney's statement was notably brief and impersonal compared to other artists' heartfelt condolences, suggesting that the competitive wounds from the disco era never fully healed. The Beach Boys, the ultimate rivalry. The most intense musical rivalry of Paul McCartney's entire career wasn't with punk rockers or stadium rock competitors. It was with America's sunshine pop pioneers, the Beach Boys. What began as mutual admiration between McCartney and Brian Wilson evolved into a bitter creative feud that music insiders still discuss and analyze decades later. Legendary producer Phil Spector noted that Paul and Brian were like two chess grandmasters, with each move one made requiring the other to respond and try to top it. It started as something friendly and inspiring, but eventually turned into an obsession for both musicians that drove them to creative extremes. The rivalry truly ignited after McCartney heard the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album in 1966. According to Beatles producer George Martin, Paul was both inspired and threatened by what he heard. He played the album constantly, analyzing every note and arrangement detail. Then he would say that the Beatles needed to go further than what the Beach Boys had achieved, which directly led to the creation of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What truly soured the relationship was the Beach Boys' Abandoned Smile album. When Brian Wilson shelved what many considered his masterpiece amid mental health struggles, McCartney was allegedly dismissive of Wilson's inability to complete the project. Beatles roadie Mal Evans recalled Paul saying that if you couldn't finish what you started, you shouldn't be in the music business. The Beatles pushed through no matter what obstacles they faced, Paul insisted. The tension reached its peak during a disastrous 1967 dinner party at Brian Wilson's home. McCartney reportedly criticized several Beach Boys songs as overly simplistic and suggested that their famous harmonies were too predictable. According to Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson, Paul left the dinner thinking he had given helpful feedback to fellow musicians, but Brian Wilson didn't speak to anyone for days afterward, deeply hurt by the criticism. Over the decades, the rivalry morphed into something colder and more distant. When asked about the Beach Boys' influence in a 1993 interview, McCartney conspicuously minimized their impact on the Beatles. He acknowledged Todd, "Had they did lovely harmonies," but insisted that people overstated how much they influenced the Beatles' development. The Beatles were already well on their way creatively, he claimed. Even in recent years, when discussing God Only Knows, a song he has called perfect, McCartney can't resist adding qualifiers like "for American pop music" or "of that period," revealing a competitive edge that time hasn't dulled or softened. As Beach Boys historian David Leaf observed, Paul respects Brian's work, but will never fully acknowledge how much it pushed him creatively, because that would mean admitting that someone else drove the Beatles' evolution rather than their own internal genius. These rivalries reveal a side of Paul McCartney that contrasts sharply with his public image as the diplomatic, cheerful Beatle. Behind the scenes, he was intensely competitive and protective of the Beatles' legacy, often viewing other successful bands as threats to be dismissed rather than peers to be celebrated. While some of these tensions have softened with age and perspective, they provide fascinating insight into the complex personality of one of music's most beloved figures.